You feel the ground disappear beneath your feet. For 1 second, you are still standing. Then you are falling, with stone walls rising around you and no way to climb back out. In ancient Rome, a mistake, a sentence, or a few words from the crowd could put you exactly there. You probably imagine ancient death as something simple, a sword, a battle, an illness. But in the ancient world, death could be slow, public, accidental, or deliberately designed to keep you alive for as long as possible. And some of the worst death did not come from war at all. They came from ordinary things: a wound, a tooth infection, bad water, a fall. Around 30–40% of people in some ancient populations may not have survived childhood, and even reaching adulthood did not make life safe. Your body had almost no protection against problems that modern medicine can solve in hours. To understand how different death once was, you have to imagine losing something you take for granted: time. Today, a serious infection can sometimes be treated before you even realize how dangerous it is. Around 400 BCE, there was no antibiotic waiting behind a hospital door. The same injury could move in a completely different direction, and sometimes humans made that direction intentional. Ancient Rome, 80 CE. In 80 CE, the Colosseum opened under Emperor Titus. You could walk into it and see tens of thousands of people watching organized violence as public entertainment. The building itself could hold an audience estimated at roughly 50,000 spectators. Some people entered the arena as trained gladiators, others entered as prisoners. The outcome was not always immediate. A defeated fighter could remain alive after being wounded. His fate depended on the decision of the person overseeing the combat, and, in some cases, the reaction of the crowd. That meant the final moments were not simply about surviving an opponent. They could become a public decision, and the arena was only one part of the system. Roman punishment could include crucifixion, a form of execution associated especially with slaves, rebels, and other people considered threats to Roman authority. The process was designed not merely to kill, but to display power. One of the most famous examples came after the Spartacus revolt in 71 BCE. Thousands of captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, the major road between Rome and Capua. Ancient sources report a line of crosses stretching for roughly 120 miles. For you, the most disturbing part is not simply the execution, it is the message. You did not need to be the intended victim. You only needed to pass by. The dead became part of the landscape. Roads, markets, temples, and arenas could all exist beside death. But public execution was still not the most dangerous thing you could face, because sometimes you could survive the original problem, and then something invisible would finish the job. Athens, 430 BCE. In 430 BCE, during the second year of the Peloponnesian War, a devastating epidemic struck Athens. The disease became known as the Plague of Athens. Historian Thucydides, who personally survived it, described the symptoms in extraordinary detail: fever, extreme thirst, physical exhaustion, severe distress. Modern researchers still debate exactly what caused the epidemic. That uncertainty mattered because you could not see the enemy. There was no soldier approaching with a weapon, no warning sound, no battlefield. You could simply wake up sick, and in a crowded city under wartime conditions, one person's illness could become thousands of deaths. Thucydides estimated that the epidemic killed around 1/3 of the Athenian population. The terrifying part was the speed at which your familiar world could become unfamiliar. Homes filled with the sick, funeral customs broke down. The routines that made civilization feel stable began to fail. But here's where it gets stranger. For much of ancient history, the most brutal deaths were not necessarily the ones that looked the most violent. Sometimes the body did almost nothing dramatic at all. It simply stopped being able to protect you, and that made one ordinary object in your mouth potentially more dangerous than a sword. Around 2,000 years ago, a damaged tooth was not a minor inconvenience. It could become a death sentence. Archaeological remains from ancient populations show extensive evidence of dental disease, abscesses, and infections. Without antibiotic, an infection that began inside your mouth could spread beyond the tooth and into surrounding tissue. You might feel only pain at first, then swelling, then fever, then something much more dangerous. The problem was not always the tooth itself. It was what bacteria could do after entering deeper tissues. A modern hospital can place you on antibiotic and monitor the infection. In the ancient world, treatment was far more limited. Ancient Egyptian medical tech dating back more than 3,000 years describe remedies for dental problems. Some involved mixtures of herbs, fats, honey, and other substances. But medicine had a fundamental problem. You could treat the symptom without stopping the infection, and infections were only one threat: ancient Britain, around 3000 BCE. Imagine walking across a landscape that looks completely safe. You are hunting, you fall, a sharp stone cuts deeply into your leg. Today, you would probably think about stitches, antibiotics, and a few weeks of recovery. Around 3000 BCE, the same wound could become something else. The archaeological record from prehistoric Europe contains skeletons showing severe injuries that healed. That tells you something important. People could survive terrible trauma, but it also reveals the opposite. Some injuries never had the chance to heal. Evidence of infection and traumatic injury appears repeatedly in ancient skeletal remains. Bone does not preserve every moment of death, but when disease progresses far enough to alter bone, it leaves a physical record. And sometimes the most revealing evidence comes from the skull. At sites across ancient Europe, researchers have found skulls containing signs of blunt force trauma. Some injuries show healing, others do not. That distinction is critical. A fracture with remodeled bone means you survived long enough for your body to repair it. A fracture without healing may indicate that the injury occurred close to death. Your skeleton can therefore become a kind of timestamp. It cannot tell you exactly what happened in every case, but it can tell you that something happened to the body shortly before life ended. The Mediterranean, over 2,000 years ago. Then there was the sea. Ancient Mediterranean trade connected Egypt, Greece, Rome, North Africa, and the Near East. Thousands of ships traveled these waters over centuries. You might think drowning was simply an accident, but shipwrecks could turn the ocean into a trap. Ancient vessels were often powered by sails and oars. Some carried hundreds of people, cargo, animals, or military equipment. If the ship broke apart during a storm, your choices were limited. No emergency radio, no helicopter, no modern life jacket designed for every passenger. And even reaching the water did not guarantee survival. Cold, exhaustion, waves, and distance from shore could become the real killers. One of the most famous ancient maritime disasters involved the Roman fleet during the First Punic War. In 241 BCE, a massive storm struck near Sicily. Ancient sources report enormous Roman losses, with estimates reaching hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. The exact numbers are debated by historians. The scale of the disaster is not. Thousands of people could disappear beneath the same waves without leaving a battlefield behind. But sometimes, the sea was not what killed you. Sometimes it was the thing living inside your body. Ancient Egypt, around 1550 BCE, the Ebers Papyrus, written around 1550 BCE, contains hundreds of medical prescriptions. It shows that ancient Egyptians understood many symptoms and experimented with treatments for wounds, parasites, stomach disorders, and infection. But knowledge had limits. You could recognize a disease without understanding the microorganism causing it. You could describe a fever without knowing why it spread. And when disease moved through a settlement, your greatest enemy could be something you could not see, smell, or fight. Parasitic infections were widespread in the ancient world. Archaeologists have even recovered preserved parasite eggs and other biological evidence from ancient settlements and mummies. In some cases, these infections were not dramatic. They slowly weakened you, they consumed nutrients, they caused anemia, they damaged organs. You could look healthy while something inside you was quietly taking resources your body needed to survive. And there was another problem. Ancient cities were becoming larger. Around 100 CE, Rome may have had a population approaching 1 million people. More people meant more food, more waste, more crowded living conditions, more opportunities for disease to move from one person to another. Civilization itself could amplify the danger. But the most disturbing deaths were sometimes not caused by nature, disease, or accidents. They were created deliberately, and when ancient societies wanted punishment to be remembered, they had methods designed to make death visible long after the person was gone. That is where the ancient world becomes darker than you might expect. One of the most feared punishments in the ancient world was not simply death. It was death combined with helplessness. Around 700 BCE, Assyrian rulers used public displays of extreme punishment to reinforce their authority. Royal inscriptions from the Neo-Assyrian Empire describe enemies being executed, impaled, or displayed after military campaigns. The message was visible from a distance. You did not need to experience the punishment yourself. You only needed to see what happened to someone who resisted. But there was an even more unsettling form of death, one where the body might remain alive while the person gradually lost the ability to escape. Rome, 73 BCE. During the revolt led by Spartacus, Rome eventually defeated the rebels in 71 BCE. The Roman commander Marcus Licinius Crassus ordered thousands of captured rebels to be crucified along the Appian Way. The exact number is debated, but ancient sources describe a punishment extending for roughly 120 miles between Rome and Capua. Imagine traveling that road. You would see the consequences of rebellion repeatedly, mile after mile. The victims were not hidden. They were part of the warning. Crucifixion could take hours, or, in some circumstances, considerably longer. Death could result from a combination of blood loss, shock, dehydration, exhaustion, and respiratory failure. Your body was still functioning. That was the point. The punishment separated death from the instant moment of execution. Time became part of the weapon, and yet even crucifixion had a limitation. The victim was still visible. Ancient societies also understood another powerful tool: fear of what might happen after you died. Egypt and the fear of the tomb. Around 2600 BCE, BCE, Egyptians were already building monumental tombs designed to last for generations. The Great Pyramid at Giza was completed around 2560 BCE. Its purpose was connected to the afterlife, but burial itself carried enormous importance. You could lose your life in a moment, but your society could spend years trying to control what happened afterward. That is why ancient tombs were protected. Doors were blocked, passages were sealed, treasures were concealed. Some tombs contained curses or warnings, although the popular idea of a supernatural curse killing modern explorers is largely a product of later storytelling. The real danger was often much simpler. A sealed underground space could contain poor air, unstable ceilings, darkness, and difficult passages. And if you became trapped, there was no rescue team waiting outside. But death was not always a dramatic final moment. Sometimes it was the accumulation of tiny dangers: a bad tooth, a contaminated wound, a parasite, a failed harvest, a storm, a single decision made on the wrong day. The ancient world was not simply more violent. That distinction mattered. Ancient people were not constantly dying in spectacular battles. Most deaths were probably much less dramatic. Disease, infection, childbirth, malnutrition, age, accidents. The brutality came from something else. You had far fewer ways to interrupt the process once it started. By the 2nd century CE, Roman physicians such as Galen had developed sophisticated ideas about anatomy and disease. Medical knowledge existed, surgery existed, pain relief existed, but modern medicine's greatest advantage was still missing. You could not reliably stop microscopic life from turning a small injury into a systemic infection. You could not replace blood quickly. You could not perform modern imaging. You could not call an ambulance. The distance between something is wrong and there is nothing more we can do was dramatically shorter. And that may be the most important difference between your world and theirs. Because when you look at an ancient skeleton, you are not looking at a different kind of human. You are looking at the same body, the same nerves that produced pain, the same lungs that needed oxygen, the same heart beating roughly 60,100 times per minute at rest in a typical adult today. Your ancestors did not experience pain as an archaeological fact. They experienced it 1 second at a time. A person injured on a battlefield around 500 BCE did not know they were becoming part of history. They only knew that something hurt. A person in Athens in 430 BCE did not know future scientists would debate the identity of the disease. They knew they were sick. A person on a Roman cross did not see the empire as a textbook subject. They saw the sky. They felt the heat. They waited. And that changes how ancient history looked, because the distance between you and them is not measured in thousands of years. It is measured in the same biological machinery. You still bruise. You still bleed. You still become thirsty. You still depend on oxygen every minute. The ancient world was not inhabited by people who were built differently. It was inhabited by people who had almost none of the barriers you now place between a human body and death. And perhaps the most brutal thing about ancient death was not how creative humans became at killing. It was how little stood between an ordinary day and an irreversible ending. For thousands of years, survival could depend on something as small as a wound you could barely see. And sometimes history turned on the difference between one more day and no more days at all.